All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for coming to our teaching, Unpacking the Nakba. My name is Joel with the Democratic Socialists. I'm going to be moderating the event today. I'm going to keep it real short, but with everything that's going on in Palestine now, as Palestinians across the entire country are rising up against the ongoing Nakba, there's never been a more important time for us to be standing with them and to be doing this work. So we're really glad to be holding this event about the beginning of the Nakba, how it's continued and how we can fight back in Rhode Island. We're going to have today a presentation with 3 speakers, followed by a brief statement from State Representative David Morales, who's going to be joining us. Then we're going to have some time for questions and discussion. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce our 3 speakers. Aya Ghanama is a Palestinian illustrator, writer, and designer. She's the founder and president of RISD Students for Justice in Palestine, and she's part of the RISD Anti-Racist Coalition. Max Binder is a Jewish anti-Zionist who grew up here in Providence. They're an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And we're also going to have Tal Frieden, who's also a Jewish anti-Zionist and is co-organizing director at Reclaim Rhode Island. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and kick it to Aya to get this presentation started.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. So my name is Aya. My pronouns are she, her, and a brief intro about me. I'm the daughter of Palestinian refugees that were displaced in Jordan, where I grew up. I want to thank you all for coming to today's event on the Palestinian Nakba, especially with all that's been going on in the last week. So I want to start us off with this quote by Muhammad al-Kurd. "You don't give a colonizer a judge's robe and then call it justice. Yet in Sheikh Jarrah, that is the essence of the story. The fox guarding the henhouse." Joel, can you turn to slides? So Muhammad al-Kurd is a friend and resident of the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem that's been on the news all week for being the subject of an ethnic cleansing campaign in the city. And a little bit on Sheikh Jarrah. So this neighborhood in Jerusalem is home to 2,800 Palestinians, and all 2,800 are refugees who were ethnically cleansed from their homes in other locations of Palestine, now in the Israeli state, during the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine, or what we call the Nakba. After 1948, the West Bank, the areas that were not occupied at that time, fell under Jordanian governance, and it stayed that way up until the rest of the territories were occupied in 1967 by Israel. So at the time, Jordan and the United Nations Relief and Works Agency reached an agreement that relocated 28 Palestinian families to this specific neighborhood in Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah. The agreement stated that the families would be granted the newly built homes in exchange for renouncing their refugee status with the UNRWA. And the Jordanian government was supposed to hand ownership titles to these Palestinian families after 3 years, but has failed to do so until this very day. Some areas of Sheikh Jarrah are one of the most prosperous in Jerusalem. They're surrounded by hotels, restaurants, and NGOs, but the neighborhood itself, where the refugee families reside, has no sidewalks and the homes are in very poor condition. This clear distinction, along with economic disparities and regular violence by the settlers around them in Jerusalem, enables direct colonial onslaught towards the marginalized community. And the Israeli state has long been ethnically cleansing Palestinians out of East Jerusalem in order to annex the entire city and incorporate it into Greater Israel. Sheikh Jarrah is one of the last and most important Palestinian neighborhoods left in the city. A lot of the residents of Sheikh Jarrah talk about how if this community is gone, Israel has essentially taken all of Jerusalem. And I think that's why it kind of blew up in the news over the last week, not because it hasn't been happening, but because it is like a huge, of huge importance and value, right? So what's been happening this week? The occupation court essentially issued a decision giving 4 families of Sheikh Jarrah until the 2nd of May to vacate their homes, and 3 other families until August 2021. Israeli authorities plan to build settlements on the ruins of the homes of these families, and they're framing this whole issue as an issue of rent disputes, essentially, saying that because the Jordanian government never officially gave them ownership, they don't actually have a right to these homes. And the residents of Sheikh Jarrah have tried for many, many years to win legal battles against the settlers, but the courts always favor Jewish Israeli settlers over Palestinians, and it has like done nothing essentially. We have to understand that the takeover of this neighborhood has not been instantaneous. In 2002, 43 Palestinians were evicted in Sheikh Jarrah after they lost a legal battle against settlers. And in 2008, the Al-Kurd family, of which Muhammad is a part of that I quoted earlier, was evicted from their home of 52 years by the Israeli police. So Palestinians have been protesting, right, and continue to. And as a result, they were met with violence from the occupation forces, and that led to more and more Palestinians uprising in different areas, not just in Jerusalem, but in the West Bank and in Israel, in solidarity, and more fighting with the occupation forces. So a lot of you may have seen on the news that there was a huge thing happening in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound where journalists recorded the occupation forces violently cracking down on protesters with tear gas and rubber bullets and essentially trapping them in. And since then, it's kind of escalated to an uprising in every single Palestinian city that has gone on for the last 5 or 6 days in the West Bank and beyond the Green Line into Greater Israel. So media outlets have been reporting disastrously, like in the West, as always, and framing this as a conflict or rent dispute issue and kind of the clashes between the Palestinian protesters and an armed military, right? And also they've been just centering anything but the Palestinians affected. So I literally went on Google and searched Palestine, and the first 3 articles that came up were about Gal Gadot and her response to the evictions and the uprisings rather than reports from the Palestinians on the ground. So it's kind of been entirely up to us to record everything that's happening and then share it and actually take over the dominant media narrative that always sides with Israel, right? And then, of course, the bombings in Gaza have begun a few days ago. And this usually happens when Palestinians kind of step out of line in any other place that isn't Gaza. Israel decides to collectively punish the population. Gaza has been under a land, sea, and air blockade by Israel and Egypt since 2007. So it's been 5 days now of constant bombing, and the death toll has already surpassed 130, of which 34 are children. The evictions of people in Sheikh Jarrah is a microcosm of Israel's ongoing attempt to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from their land on the grounds of settler colonialism and Zionism. And we'll get more into Zionism as this presentation moves forward. But for now, I want people to understand what settler colonialism means. So settler colonialism is a term that is basically a state that functions through the replacement of an indigenous population with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. And this is different than colonialism because colonialism is organized around a logic of exploitation, while settler colonialism is organized around the logic of elimination. Some settler colonies are the US, Israel, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And the other term is apartheid, that you probably heard a lot in context of Israel. And apartheid is defined as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. And over the last couple of weeks, the Human Rights Watch actually released a report calling Israel an apartheid state. And so did the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem earlier this year. So now we're going to get to talk about kind of what happened in 1948. So the reason that today is so significant is because today marks 73 years since the Palestinian Nakba Day, Nakba meaning catastrophe, in which 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their lands and homes. 400 to 600 villages were sacked and wiped off the map, and thousands of Palestinians, men, women, and children alike were murdered. Laws were passed by the first Israeli government upon its establishment that prevented Palestinians who had left during that year, so from 1947 to 48, to return to their homes or claim their property. And for most Palestinian refugees at this time, you kind of just like packed your things because like there's a lot going on, you didn't want to be massacred, and left, or you were forced out of your home. But it was always with the expectation that you'd be returning in a couple of days, weeks, months, years, whatever it is. And for Palestinians, it's been like 3 to 4 generations, and people still live in exile. The Nakba, we have to understand, was not an unintended result of war. It was a deliberate and systemic act necessary for the creation of a Jewish majority state in historic Palestine, which was overwhelmingly Arab prior to 1948. In fact, even in 1948, the Jewish population did not exceed a third. And internally, Zionist Jewish leaders used the euphemism transfer, in quote, when they were discussing plans for what would today be known as ethnic cleansing. This was possible because in 1947, in November of that year, the United Nations approved a plan to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. It allocated approximately 55% of the land to the proposed Jewish state, although Zionist Jews only owned about 7% of the private land in Palestine and made up about 33% of the population. And the Palestinian Arab state was to be created on 42% of mandate Palestine, with Jerusalem becoming an international city that doesn't belong to either side. Almost immediately after this partition plan was passed, violence broke out, obviously, and large-scale expulsions of Palestinians began long before any neighboring countries got involved. And Zionist forces continued to expand way past the 55% that was not agreed upon, but established in the partition plan that they agreed with the UN. And they ended up taking 78% of historic Palestine, with the remainder, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, falling under the control of Jordan and Egypt. So Israel celebrates today as their Independence Day. The Zionist narrative frames the story as one of freedom from the British, who had controlled Palestine since the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. And this narrative completely ignores that a native population was ever there, and that their ethnic cleansing did not take place to make way for the state, and that they never had a say in what happened to them in the first place. Because Palestine had kind of went from Ottoman Empire into like a British mandate, they never had, they were not allowed to have any kind of government, any kind of party, any kind of system, union, organization to establish themselves, speak for themselves, or have any say in like what happened to them. Meanwhile, the Zionist organizations had backing from European powers, Western powers, and had been been doing that for a very, very long time, right? And we have to understand that the Palestinian population was also 96% peasants. So that also played a role, and most of them had been on the land that they'd lived on for centuries. And this land was just kind of purchased while they were there with no say in it, like over like 30 or so years from World War I until Israel was established without their consent. And that's important to know because a lot of the time people talk about the partition plan and like how that would have been a fair deal, but it never was, right? It was a land that had people living on it, and a group of people invaded the society and established a new state in their place, right? So this Nakba, it created millions of Palestinian refugees displaced both internally and externally in modern-day Israel as Arab second-class citizens with limited rights and no recognition of their ethno-national identity. And in the occupied, annexed territories of the West Bank and Gaza, stateless and subjected to military occupation and state-sponsored and settler violence. And then, of course, in the diaspora, there are millions living in refugee camps to this very day. So I grew up around family and friends who each had their own Nakba story. My late grandfather was 8 years old in 1948 when Israel occupied most of the country, and his family ended up in the West Bank. My grandmother was, her mother was from a city called Haifa, which is today in Israel. And her family could not return after 48, and she was born in the West Bank. And my mother's village, if we go back to the previous slide, there's like a map of every single like village that was depopulated and destroyed, no longer exists. So she's from a village called Miska, and it was one of the many that were like planned to be depopulated and destroyed. Today, a Jewish settlement exists on the ruins of what that village once was. And on the next slide, I put in a picture of like a frame from my grandfather's house to talk about kind of the right of return for refugees and what the Palestinian cause is all about. The cause itself is shaped by this right to return that Israel denies us. Palestinian refugees are the largest and longest lasting refugee group in the world. When Israel waged the 1967 war after the Nakba and occupied the West Bank and Gaza, another 400,000 were forced into exile. And from the groups that were expelled in 48 and 67 stems today's Palestinian refugee population, which has now swelled to more than 7 million people in the diaspora. 40% of the world's refugee population are Palestinian. And of the Palestinian population, 74% of us are refugees as well. And as you can see, like from this photograph, a lot of us still have the keys to our homes that we were forced out of in the past. So my grandfather holds on to this key, hoping one day he can return to the home that he has not been able to return to since 1948. I'll hand it over to Max now to speak in depth about Zionism and the history behind why and how the Nakba took place and why this was possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aya. And yeah, I think it was the background for the Nakba is so important because 700,000 people being forcibly evicted from their homes. This is a catastrophe, which of course is what Nakba means. My name is Max. My pronouns are they, them. I am an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And I am just now turning on my video. Yeah, I'm going to go over through the history of how Israel came into being in very brief form, and how it became the apartheid state that it is today. Because Israel was founded and maintained by an ideology called Zionism, right? So what does Zionism mean? Zionism is the political conviction that there must be a Jewish state. And nowadays, that specifically means the conviction that there must be a Jewish state in Israel. So let's go to the next slide. Let's start right at the beginning. The first World Zionist Congress took place in Basel, Switzerland. And the goal was to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. So the Congress, the World Zionist Congress, right, this organization of a small group of people who wanted to found a Jewish state, sent a delegation to Palestine. But they reported, and this was their quote from the telegram, "The bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man." What they meant was Palestine had its own people, which included a 5% population of Arab Jews even before settlement. This is a picture from Old Jerusalem before the Zionist settlement project began, when it was still under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Although most of the population was Arab, it was pan-religious, right? Something like 70% Muslims, 25% Christians, and about 5% Jews. So let's move on to the next slide. In the American mainstream, whenever someone criticizes Israel or Zionism, we often hear politicians or the news media or organizations decry those people as anti-Semitic, right? You criticized Israel, you must hate Jews. This claim is based on a false belief that Israel represents the entire Jewish people, which has never been the case. When Zionism was founded, it was a minority movement. In the early 1900s, very few European Jews wanted a Jewish state. In fact, many Jews from Eastern Europe through Russia were fighting for socialism. They saw Jewish liberation as being possible only in an internationalist workers' state, where working people, not the wealthy, were in power. They saw their freedom in joining hands with other oppressed peoples, and they had no interest in leaving their homes to immigrate to a place that they had never been to. Let's go to the next slide. So Zionists actually collaborated with powerful anti-Semites in order to achieve their vision. Theodor Herzl, the man pictured on the left, is an Austrian Jew who is known as the founder of Zionism. And he had to sell his project to the imperial powers in order to get land and support to found a Jewish state. So in his 1897 text, The State of the Jews, this is from right before 1900, Herzl wrote that a Jewish state in Palestine could be, quote, a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. What in essence he was offering was to help Europeans advance their violent racist conquest of the world in order to create a Jewish state. So in order to do this, he appealed first to Cecil Rhodes, who was the colonial mastermind behind the horrible settler states in British South Africa. In Russia, he met with the enthusiastic Minister of the Interior, von Plehve, who was responsible for organizing the most violent pogroms, which are essentially lynch mobs against Russian Jews. So he was literally collaborating with these forces of empire who had sought to crush oppressed peoples in the recent past, like within the last few years. Let's go to the next slide. The Zionist movement soon won British support to colonize Palestine, which had been put under British control after World War I with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Chaim Weizmann, who was Herzl's successor, understood Britain's imperial interests. So he was offering that a Jewish state could help maintain British domination over the Suez Canal in Egypt, which would also aid British control over the Middle East and its trade with its Asian colonies. Israel would, by the way, make good on this promise in 1956 by invading Egypt and kickstarting the Suez Crisis. Now, the British colonizers had no special love for the Jewish people. It wasn't because they saw an oppressed people and they wanted to help them that they helped them to build a state in Palestine. In fact, they were happy to get rid of them. Winston Churchill, who was serving as the British colonial secretary in 1921 when Zionist colonization was beginning, made his views clear in a newspaper article entitled Good Jews and Bad Jews. In the same article where he praised Zionism for its humble nationalist goals, he repeated the anti-Semitic trope that Jewish leftists were plotting, quote, a worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization. Next slide. When settlers began arriving in Palestine in the early 1900s, they bought land from landlords, as Aya had explained, and they evicted Palestinian peasants who had no idea that their land had been sold. Tensions were, of course, immediate. Everyone could see that the only way to build a Jewish state was through military buildup, with resources flowing in from Britain. While future Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion shied away from discussing the violence publicly, right-wing Zionist leader Vladimir Jabotinsky wrote with brutal honesty in 1923, settlements can thus develop under the protection of a force that is not dependent upon the local population, behind an iron wall, which they will be powerless to break down. A voluntary agreement is just not possible. As long as the Arabs preserve a gleam of hope that they will succeed in getting rid of us, nothing in the world can cause them to relinquish this hope, precisely because they are not rubble, but a living people. The Arabs loved their country as much as the Jews did. Instinctively, they understood Zionist aspirations very well, and their decision to resist them was only natural. So this is a right-wing leader of the Zionist movement in Israel at this time. And you can see that he is stating only the obvious, that by coming in and trying to force people off of their land, you are going to get resistance, and is stating that as a result, what is necessary is precisely this occupation that would follow, and this brutal conquest and division. Let's go to the next slide. British support was critical for settling Israel by force. The British supplied the Zionists with everything from favorable contacts to weapons and training for the Zionist militias. The dynamics of favorable contracts, by the way, that makes more sense. The dynamics of conquest shone through in every phase of Israeli settlement, which the whole settlement process was marred by forced evictions and massacre, which culminated in the Nakba, but continued afterwards. These policies were not always popular with Israel's colonial benefactors, so Israel began arguing that their invasions were retaliation for attacks by Palestinians. Remember, we see that 20 years ago, they already knew that they needed to invade, but this doctrine of retaliation becomes popular later on. So this is argued even to this day. And David Ben-Gurion, who again would become the first prime minister of Israel, admitted that Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation was justified. So here's a quote from him. He says, "When we say that the Arabs are the aggressors and we defend ourselves, that is only half the truth. As regards our security and life, we defend ourselves, but the fighting is only one aspect of the conflict, which is in its essence a political one. And politically, we are the aggressors and they defend themselves. So I think that's clear as day. So let's move on to the next slide. Israeli leaders for generations, all the way up to and including Netanyahu, the current prime minister, have emphasized that the Jewish state can exist only by maintaining a Jewish majority. In 1969, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin warned an Israeli audience of the danger of conceding even the concept of Palestine. So he was saying, we can't even let the idea of a Palestinian state float. And he said this to justify it. If this is Palestine and not the land of Israel, then you are conquerors and not tillers of the land. You are invaders. If this is Palestine, then it belongs to a people who lived here before you came. Begin, by the way, represents one of the early and principal figures in the rise of right-wing tendencies, further right-wing of the norm, which is already colonization in Israel, which leads up to the present moment. Next slide, please. So following the Nakba, when the Israeli state was founded, the government expanded and developed an apartheid state by force, crushing Palestinians through wanton violence and eviction. Even today, Zionists often justify this policy of conquest as merely deterrence against attacks by a hateful enemy. But we don't have to look any further than the history of the United States to see that defense is a justification for genocide. The idea, oh, we're just defending ourselves against these brutal natives. The first settlers to the United States lived in relative peace with the natives, sometimes even on friendly terms. But after the colonists began stealing land and slaughtering indigenous peoples, they developed an attitude of animosity. So the colonists started seeing the indigenous people as bloodthirsty and violent. They began 300 years of evictions and genocide using coercive treaties, forced marches, and assimilation through boarding schools to destroy native culture, community, and sovereignty. Let's look at some parallels in Israeli conquest on the next slide. Turning to maps, we can see just how violently Israeli settlement proceeded. Early on, the Jews had settled very little land in Israel, as you can see on the left side of this four-part map. The Zionist advance continued through the first part of the 20th century, but was actually hastened by the 1947 UN partition plan, when Israel decided it wasn't going to settle for the small amount of land that it had, and unleashed a campaign, which, by the way, is already, as you can see, more than 50% of Palestinian territory. So Israel decided to unleash a campaign of terror to seize even more lands than had been allocated, leading to the Nakba. Then, in the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel attacked Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, seizing Gaza, the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. After mass evictions, Israel pursued a policy of aggressive settlement throughout the West Bank, seizing fertile land, surrounding and dividing Palestinian cities while subsidizing Jewish settlers through international aid, as we can see in the shrinking territory of the West Bank on the final map. Next slide. Today, Palestinians living in the West Bank are divided and blocked in by a vast apartheid wall, surrounded by military patrols and checkpoints through which Palestinians must travel, including in urgent situations like getting to a hospital. And these checkpoints are notorious for harassment and delays that can take hours. Gaza is one of the most densely populated places in the world. It's home to more than 2 million people, and it's surrounded by a massive fence and military blockade, which makes resources scarce. It has been called the world's largest open-air prison. Meanwhile, anti-Arab vitriol is spread throughout Israel through politics and universal military service. Palestinian Israeli citizens have limited civil rights, and the military hides but continues practices of illegal assassinations up to and including nighttime home invasions. Next slide. All of this is made possible by US military aid. From 1949 to 2009, Israel received approximately $206 billion in aid, which is a number that's adjusted for inflation, which is why you might not see that high of a number online, but the dollars in 1949 are worth a lot more today. And this aid includes grants, bonds, forgivable loans, and weapons. It is more than American aid to any other country and more than all of our aid to other countries combined. And in exchange, Israel carries out attacks against US enemies that would make the US look bad. It helps to maintain US dominance over the oil-rich Middle East. And the US protects Israel unequivocally without asking any questions because it forms a crucial piece of the puzzle in its global empire. The endless wars propagated by the US all across the world are at this point unavoidable. Why? Because wars create new markets and destroy competitors. And by competitors, I mean nations that would break away from the US in order to develop on their own. Claims of terrorism help to justify the wars. As we have seen in, for instance, Iraq and Afghanistan, but they cannot possibly justify the utter destruction wreaked upon these countries, where the military in Iraq and Afghanistan up until today was unable to crush the resistance completely. Next slide. In the same way, Israel has failed to crush Palestinian resistance. From those living in Gaza and the West Bank, to Palestinians in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, to those within the current Israeli borders, the 1948 Palestine borders, existence and resistance have long been synonymous for the Palestinian people. They rose up in an intifada, which means uprising, between 1936 and 1939, before the Nakba. Then again after, in 1987 and 90, all the way to 93. This is a 6-year period of uprising. And later in the Al-Aqsa Intifada from 2000 until 2005, Palestinians engage in daily acts of resistance like throwing rocks at soldiers, even though this could cost them their lives. Thousands marched in weekly protests during the Great March of Return from 2018 to 2019, despite dozens being killed by Israel. Next slide. Constant Israeli violence has certainly fostered anti-Israel sentiments, but many Palestinians simply wish to become equals and return to their homes. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, which is using the same tactics as were waged to end apartheid in South Africa, has only 3 demands. End the military occupation and colonization of Palestine and dismantle the wall. Recognize fully equal citizenship for Palestinian citizens of Israel, so end Palestinian apartheid. And allow Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. This struggle is continuing today, and our part in that struggle is critical. The war against Palestine will be vastly unequal as long as Israel is backed by the largest military power in the world. Living in the heart of empire, we must do our part to dismantle the US war machine so that Palestine may be free. Let's go to my last slide. So if you want to learn more about the history of the Palestinian struggle and how it connects to the US, there are so many free resources on around right now. I'm going to give you just one, but feel free to look for others. The Party for Socialism and Liberation has released Palestine, Israel, and the US Empire online as a free ebook from now until May 19th. It's a sharp, thorough, very readable analysis of the struggle for Palestine. It's firmly rooted in the politics of Palestinian liberation. And I will drop a link that into the chat. With that, the book contains a complete index and a timeline of developments in the history of Palestine. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tal, who is going to help us connect the struggle in Palestine to our situation in the US and in Rhode Island today.
Thank you so much, Max and Aya, for those really incredible and succinct summaries of the Nakba. And I'm just going to go into a little bit of how we see the Nakba's effects from here in the US and how we're implicated in this, in the Nakba, and how we can also resist. So as we know, the Nakba is currently ongoing as we speak. There are missiles fired into Gaza this week, forced expulsions in Jerusalem, the over 400-mile-long apartheid wall that snakes through the West Bank, and the discrimination and expulsion of Palestinians in what is called Israel. But where does that bring us today in the US and in Rhode Island? Well, we can start actually by looking at our president. Biden has a long history of supporting the Israeli regime, and we can see its consequences this past week. Here's a video of Biden in 1986, making a lot of the same arguments that the founders of Zionism made back in the 1800s.
We look at the Middle East. I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
So in the video, Biden makes it clear that the United States support for Israel is a calculated $3 billion investment in a military outpost and has nothing to do with respect for human rights or self-determination. And here we can see some headlines for the past week that show the consequences of that position. Al Jazeera has reported that the US blocked a Security Council resolution condemning Israeli violence with our United States veto power. And Biden has said on the matter that Israel has the right to defend itself. And that's basically the extent of his comments on the ongoing Israeli violence this week. Next slide, please. So there is a cycle of funding, training, and technology that moves between Israel and the US, strengthening Israeli security forces and introducing new technologies of oppression to American police and border patrol, and solidifying US political support for Israel. The United States subsidizes Israeli oppression of Palestinians and imports Israeli tactics and weapons back to the US. I'll say that again. The United States subsidizes Israeli oppression of Palestinians and imports Israeli tactics and weapons back to the US. We see $3.8 billion per year backing at the UN, missiles, warplanes, and other weapons being sent to Israel. And in exchange, the United States imports these battle-tested weapons, training for police officers and border patrol, surveillance technology, and as Biden has articulated, a military outpost in the region. Next slide. One of Israel's most expansive programs is the training of United States police forces by the Israeli military. Thousands of US police forces and ICE officers, as well as Customs and Border Patrol, Homeland Security, are trained in Israel every single year in a program that has been deemed the deadly exchange. Here are some quotes from United States police chiefs on how much they value their collaboration with the Israeli military. So here we see the direct import of Israeli tactics and oppressive policies into United States policing. Next slide. And we should all know Rhode Island is no exception. Multiple members of the Rhode Island State Police have gone on Israel to learn from the Israeli military and police, including Lieutenant Colonel Philbin of the Rhode Island State Police, who traveled to Israel in December 2018 and returned to give a speaking tour on his learnings in Israel. You can also see our former Governor Gina Raimundo with the president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin. She traveled to Israel on a delegation with a number of other governors and spoke highly of her experience learning from Israeli political leaders. Next slide. These police chiefs are training with the same security forces that regularly arrest children, detain them indefinitely, and subject them to torturous conditions. Over 500 Palestinian children per year are detained in Israeli military prisons. Because the West Bank is an occupied territory and is under Israeli military control, these children do not have access to civilian courts when they're arrested. Instead, they're tried in Israeli military courts adjacent to the Israeli military prisons. Next slide. But it's not just personnel that travels between Israel and the US, it's a slew of technology tools that are used to suppress human rights in Palestine and here in the US and across the world. One such technology is the Cellbrite phone hacking device, which US police forces have purchased from Israel and used to bypass private passcodes on individual cell phones. Next slide. In fact, Rhode Island police forces have spent around $50,000. This might be an outdated figure, actually it could be more, purchasing these devices in order to hack Rhode Islanders' cell phones. Next slide. But this technology of oppression goes beyond hacking cell phones. A web of cybersecurity companies, weapons manufacturers, and other companies create technology that is tested on Palestinians and then exported across the world. As you can see here, the guard towers that are part of the Israeli apartheid wall that snakes through the West Bank, the security systems in occupied East Jerusalem that track the movements of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and drones that are used to disperse tear gas at protests are all examples of technologies that are developed in Israel and then exported abroad as well. Next slide. One small example is Lbit Systems, an Israeli company that creates drones and surveillance technology. Its drones are used to bomb Gaza, and Lbit operates many of the hundreds of guard towers along the apartheid wall that Israel built to divide the West Bank. Lbit also monitors the extensive network of surveillance cameras in occupied East Jerusalem. And I should note that after their trip to Israel, the Atlanta Police Department implemented a similar surveillance system across the city of Atlanta. Lbit has been incredibly successful at exporting its technology abroad. The EU has contracted with Lbit Systems in order to monitor and surveil migrants on their way to Europe. And in the United States, Lbit has contracted with ICE and CBP on guard towers and drones across the southern United States border. And these drones have been purchased by a number of militaries across the world. Next slide, and trigger warning, some of these images may be disturbing. Lbit drones have been used for some of Israel's most egregious attacks on Palestinians, such as an attack in 2014 when the Israeli military used an Lbit drone in one of the most horrific one of the killings that has garnered much media attention. In 2014, 4 children in Gaza went to play soccer on the beach. Ahed Atef Bakr, Zakaria Ahed Bakr, Mohammed Ramez Bakr, and Ismail Mohammed Bakr were all under the age of 12 when they went to the beach in Gaza to play soccer. While they were playing, they were struck by a missile that was launched from an Lbit system drone, and all 4 of them were killed. Next slide. So once we start following the network of weapons manufacturers, surveillance purveyors, and other companies that create the tools of oppression, we can realize how global the struggle for Palestine is. That's why the Black Lives Matter movement and others have made support for Palestinian liberation critical to their work, and why Palestinians have united under the banner "From Ferguson to Palestine, occupation is a crime." Our oppressions are connected, and so our resistance must be connected too. I want to name that it's more than just military technology. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to jump into all of the examples, but environmental racism, police brutality, segregation, there are parallels between these systems in the United States and Palestine. Here in Rhode Island, we see the Port of Providence polluting communities of color, the 10-6 connector highway and other highways dividing our cities and polluting communities of color, destroying families' homes. In Palestine, in the West Bank, we see Israeli settlements, Jewish settlements in the West Bank, dumping their raw sewage into the valleys where Palestinian villages exist, and the Israeli military providing planning support for highways that destroy Palestinian farmlands and that can only be used by Israeli settlers. So what can we do? Next slide. Palestinian civil society has united behind the call for BDS, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and has asked all of us to join this movement in solidarity. What does BDS mean, though? Next slide. I have definitions here. Boycotts involve withdrawing support from Israel's apartheid regime, complicit sporting, cultural, and academic institutions, and from all Israeli and international companies engaged in violations of Palestinian human rights. Divestment campaigns urge banks, local councils, churches, pension funds, and universities to withdraw investments from the state of Israel and all Israeli and international companies that sustain Israeli apartheid. Sanctions campaigns pressure governments to fulfill their legal obligations to end Israeli apartheid and not aid or assist in its maintenance by banning business with illegal Israeli settlements, ending military trade and free trade agreements, as well as suspending Israel's membership in international forums such as UN bodies and FIFA. Next slide. But what can we do here in Rhode Island? So let's look at the three pillars of support that Israel receives from the US. Political support: we can pressure our elected officials to speak out on Palestine and demand that our elected officials reject trips to Israel and other forms of collaboration. And we can end police and other trainings in Israel and with the IDF, the Israeli military. We can boycott companies that support Israeli apartheid and boycott institutions that collaborate with the IDF. And we can divest state pensions, endowments, investments from Israeli apartheid. And perhaps most importantly, we can end US military aid to Israel. Next slide. So here in Rhode Island, I just want to name 3 companies here in Rhode Island that are all making deals with the Israeli military. Raytheon sells missiles to the Israeli military, General Dynamics sells bombs and gun systems, and Textron sells drones and attack helicopters to Israel. And next slide. I just want to name quickly that Textron is headquartered here in Providence, and they collaborate with Lbit Systems on drone technologies like the ones that killed the 4 children on the beach of Gaza. Next slide. So ending US military aid to Israel. It's become clear that US military aid is a foundation of Israel's military prowess. $3.8 billion a year with no conditions are sent to support the Israeli military. And that's why Palestine solidarity organizations are supporting a bill in Congress that would condition aid to Israel so that it can't be used to detain children, demolish homes, and annex land. But so far, this bill only has 16 sponsors, and none of our legislators from Rhode Island have signed on. So that's why we're asking everyone to take a minute to ask our representatives to sign on to this bill to condition aid to Palestine. We'll send the link in the chat. But I want to name, this is just a first step. It will take much more than just these letters or this bill to end Israeli colonization of Palestine, but this is a critical piece of the resistance and brings us closer to seeing a free Palestine. We're going to take questions now, and I'll let Joel say a bit about how we're going to do questions. But first, please use the link in the chat to send a letter to our representatives here in Rhode Island and tell them to condition aid to Israel. And with that, I'll pass it back to Joel.